7 o'clock. We can go ahead and get started, I think. Thanks everybody so much for coming out tonight on this very beautiful day of the opening lug nut season. Sorry if you're missing baseball to be here. And thanks to everybody also who's watching online through the live stream as well. We're still working out the technology a little bit, but we're getting there. So appreciate everybody's patience with that. My name is May Euler. I'm the engagement manager here at the Capitol building. I'm joined by Brian Page, who is our registrar and webmaster. I'm going to be talking about some old-timey technology at the Capitol. And thanks also to Cambry Sampson, who's being our tech guru moderator tonight. And if you do enjoy this, come on back on May 7th when Valerie Marvin's going to be talking about the Michigan Female College. And this will be right here, 7 p.m. on May 7th, same place. So to start off with, I do want to talk a little bit about what we actually mean when we say Gilded Age, because we could have easily called this late 19th century tech at the Capitol building. But apart from being too wordy, I thought Gilded Age was a better touch. Gilded Age usually kind of refers to American history from about 1870 to about 1900, and our Capitol opening 1879 puts us right in that sweet spot. And this is a time period of increasing industrialization and mechanization. Big businesses in the US are getting a lot bigger, a lot faster, and the divide between rich and poor is growing exponentially. So that term Gilded Age, it's often used to highlight the extreme contrast in material resources and life experiences between different social classes in the US. And I think the availability of technology at this time kind of exemplifies that contrast. I mean, the Capitol is literally and figuratively a gilded building, right? So this is built to be a showplace. It's going to have the very best, most up-to-date technology that the state building commissioners are willing to pay for, right? But the technologies in a big, significant public building like ours, they are not going to be available in every other part of the state for many years. You know, it takes a long time for new technologies to become part of our daily life. I think most of us in this room remember life before Wi-Fi. So if you think about like, when's the point when you start to actually like use Wi-Fi? It's probably at school, at work, at a public library, and then think about how long before it's you actually get that in your own home to use every single day. And then how long is it before you get that, you know, in the palm of your hand on your phone? You know, it takes some time for these things to kind of sink into daily life. So the Capitol, it's built at the technological forefront, and a lot of the things that we had available in this building, they are very new. They're things that people maybe have not seen before. They're exciting, they're surprising, they're maybe a little bit scary sometimes. So tonight, I'm hoping that we can kind of relive that experience of discovering these new technologies together as we look at some of these systems. And of course, technology, that can mean a lot of things. So for the sake of organization and our own mental health, we're kind of talking about two big categories tonight. We're going to start with what I think of as infrastructure tech. That's stuff like heating, ventilation, lighting, things that are sort of built into the structure itself. And then we're going to work kind of from the insides of the walls out and talk more about communications technologies, telephones, typewriters, speaking tubes, the things that kind of facilitate the work of government in this building. And this is where I remind you that Brian and I are history people and we are not engineering people. So we're doing our very best to explain some really complicated and kind of obscure systems tonight. So thank you for your patience if we get something wrong or if we don't include all the details that you're hoping for. I appreciate that. So with that, I'm going to let Brian come up here and talk a little bit more about how we actually found the information that we are going to share.
Thanks, May. So I was talking about it a little bit here for folks who just came in. We have some artifacts up on our table from some of the systems that May and I will be just discussing tonight. Feel free to come up after and take a look. I'll show some of them too on camera for folks watching online. But this program was a little bit different from our usual programs we do. It felt different in that we didn't actually have a lot of information from the building itself to draw upon for some of these early systems for the building. A lot of it was kind of brand new to the point where some of these things didn't even have proper names. For instance, there was an article where they referred to as gauges, like the one we see on the table here, as a dial that resembles a clock face, right? They didn't have the idea of what this was yet. So finding information on this stuff can be a little tough at times. So in really, really magical, lucky cases, we have actual artifacts that we can draw knowledge from and study how this stuff worked. But in most cases, it's drawing upon Senate and House reports, newspaper articles, drawings of the original plans of the building. And what this kind of made us do was reach out to places that we don't usually look in for sources, such as like historic preservation blogs and scientific journals, old and new, to try and get an idea of how these systems would have been utilized in the building. And we had to make some, inferences here and there and how this may have been used. So there might be a little bit of like artistic liberty with it, right? Of us trying to presume how these things were used. So we'll go through that tonight. But I think with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our first system. I'll turn it over to May.
Okay, so start with the essentials. I'm pushing down, hang on. There we go, just do that. So obviously, a heating system is going to be essential for any building in Michigan. And for a building as large as the Capitol, the best option in the 1870s is steam heating. Elijah Meyer's plans for the building included space for boiler rooms, steam pipes, radiators, ventilation shafts, all these other things that could be kind of built into the walls and ceilings. And the state building commissioners actually published a set of specifications about how to build the boilers and the heating systems that they would give out to contractors. And so those companies could provide the appropriate equipment. And this document goes on for like 20 pages. It's talking about every detail from like how many pounds of pressure the boilers are supposed to use to circulate steam through the building, right down to like the diameter of the return pipes on the radiators, right? So it's clearly something that the architect and the commissioners spent a lot of time thinking about. And these boilers, I mean, they're providing heating and venting. They're also pumping water through the building. So these are very much like workhorses. And I've got the one of Meyer's original plans kind of showing you a cross section of those brick vaults. They built them under the far ends of the north and south wings, tucked into the porticos, just in case of explosions. So it's further away from the rest of the building. And if you actually do walk down the ground floor, down that south wing, you can still see where it says boiler room actually etched into the stone, which is pretty cool. And I think I did put in a little blow up plan. This is sort of the floor plan of one of those boiler rooms. I can get oh, there we go. You look to the side here, I got my laser pointer. So he's actually drawn out where those boilers are going to sit inside those vaults. And to get a little closer, this is his plan of kind of the front view of those boilers with kind of a slice taken off. And obviously we've got some very pretty Renaissance revival design going on in there. A lot of really pretty flourishes. There's actually some Corinthian columns in here. I don't know for sure if the boilers actually ended up looking that nice, but I really hope they did because it just fits so well with the rest of the building. And I'm pretty sure that the boilers that the Capitol had were what were called fire tube boilers. These were cylindrical pieces. They sit horizontally in those brick vaults. And these little circles that you can see in here, these little kind of dots, are actually metal tubes that run horizontally down the length of those cylinders. And surrounding those tubes inside this cylinder is water. So if we go into Meyer's next plan of kind of you get a different sort of view of what's going on inside these boilers. Down here at the bottom, he's labeled these grates. So you would actually stoke a coal fire down under there. This is underneath the cylinder. The cylinder is kind of sitting up top here. And the heat and the smoke from that coal, that burning coal, would go up and around and through these tubes. And so the coal smokes kind of exits out a ventilation section here in the front. And meanwhile, the water that is surrounding these tubes that are now getting hot from this coal fire, it's heating that water into steam, which then vents out the top of these boilers and can be circulated through the building. And the steam is kind of rising up through there and traveling through about 35 total miles of steam piping, according to 1870s newspapers. They reported that the kind of steam pipes and the fittings arrived in March in 1876, and they described 4 carloads of these fittings. And we're talking train cars, if that gives you an idea about the actual scale of this system. And so the steam is traveling into radiators in the various rooms of the Capitol building. And inside each radiator is a system of metal tubes or fins where the steam's getting circulated around. It's cooling as it's circulating, and it releases its heat into the surrounding room. And of course, because we are in the Capitol building, our radiators can't be plain old ugly radiators. They have to be pretty radiators. We've got some beautiful acanthus leaves and flower details in Meyer's drawings here. If you look really carefully, he has actually indicated where the openings are around all these little pieces. And these would have been made out of cast iron. And they're not, I think these are usually built out underneath windows, because if you've got a little space for some air opening, an air vent under the window, it helps to cool the steam faster. And it also theoretically helps to circulate that air, that warm air around the room a little bit easier. So it kind of enhances that feature. So our boilers are taking care of the winter time, but obviously eventually the snow does melt in Michigan. And if you look here, this is the specifications for the systems I was talking about, and you'll notice it does say heating and ventilation. In nowadays, we kind of tend in our modern buildings to try to keep all of our heat and all of our cool inside as much as possible. In the 19th century, they were a lot more concerned with airflow from the inside to the inside of the building and then out again. This is not only a way to make it more comfortable in the summertime when you do not have air conditioning, but it's also a point of public health. At this time, Western medicine is just kind of coming to terms with germ theory. We're just figuring out how exactly diseases are spread. And there were a lot of theories that suggested that stuffy, stagnant air or even just bad smells could make you ill. And we know there is some truth in this. We've lived through COVID. We know that fresh air is better for us. And this does make a lot of sense, especially when you consider this is a society that is trying very desperately to deal with tuberculosis, right? So in a big, sometimes very crowded public building like the Capitol, getting fresh air in here, it's going to be important. Opening the windows is not quite going to be enough. And so we would look closer up at Meyer's plans here. That was just a whole plan of the 4th floor. But if you kind of zoom in, you can find air shafts on here. There's some built around the rotunda, and there's also some at the very far ends of the north and south wings. And these would have openings like into the living spaces of the building so that what they called foul air could be extracted through those air shafts. And inside each one would actually be a coil of steam piping, which basically acted as another radiator. And as the steam was circulated through those coils by one of those boilers, it would help to push that foul air into the shafts and up and out of the building. And if you look in here, this lovely image is actually a picture of one of those openings into the foul air shafts from the Senate chamber. They are still up there, very carefully concealed in the decorative artwork. We get questions about those all the time. And these actually opened up into these big shafts on the far north and south wings. That's actually where our cupolas are at. That's what they are for, is to top these foul air shafts. And these are, again, included in Meyer's plans in here. And if you look a little bit closer, you might be able to see where it is labeled foul air shaft, kind of around the edges of this kind of square space. And in the middle is a smokestack. And that smokestack is what was carrying the coal fumes and smoke out from the boiler rooms. So you kind of get this almost like chimney system, pulling air into the building and letting it out. And even in the summertime, you would have one of these boilers running to heat up those coils inside the air shafts and encourage the air to keep flowing from your open windows through your rooms up and out. All right. And today we do still have the cupolas. If you look carefully, you can find them on the roof line, but they are purely decorative nowadays. In 1949, the old air shafts in the north and south ends were actually repurposed into elevator shafts. But by that time, the Capitol had already lived through a few generations of elevators. This was the style of elevator we had when the building opened in 1879. It was just off of the rotunda, the north elevator. It's a very small space. You may have been on that before. And of course, before electrical power was in the building, this was actually powered by water. Hale's duplex water elevator, invented in 1875. This is an actual drawing that the company made to market their water elevator. So it gives us an idea of kind of what's going on in here. And if you look carefully, this was connected to a water tank up on the fourth floor. And behind the car of the elevator, there's this big cylindrical tube with a piston inside of it. And inside, we can see there's actually a rope, what they call a shipper rope, running vertically through the roof and down through the floor of the elevator. So the elevator operator could pull down on this rope and it would connect into a valve at the bottom of the shaft, which would allow water to enter through the top of this piston and out of the bottom. And this would pull the piston down and elevate the car. And then when you go the opposite direction, the elevator operator pulls up on the rope, it closes the valve, the water inside the piston moves to the bottom, and the car sinks again. So and it's a really interesting system, I think. And if you look really closely at this drawing, you'll see some interesting details. There's actually a little bench inside the car. We've got this elevator operator who's wearing a tailcoat. These very elegantly dressed patrons, right? The first passenger elevators were built not for office buildings. These were for fancy hotels. These were for fancy department stores. These were for businesses who were very concerned with impressing their clientele and making sure that the elevator ride was a very elegant and genteel experience. In the Capitol, elevator rides were not very genteel experiences. There were issues with the elevator as soon as the building opened. Part of the problem is just that it was difficult to get enough water pressure in a building this tall. And the more people you've got riding in the elevator car, obviously that problem gets a lot more difficult. I have included this little clip from the Lansing Republican in 1879. I apologize because it's a really mean joke, but they're basically saying about a representative who accidentally caused the elevator to get stuck. And they're suggesting he's too big to use the elevator, basically. It's really mean. But I like to include it because it does show that we did have this problem. And of course, the other question that comes up with this system is how do you get the elevator to stop where you need it to be? There are no call buttons on this elevator. So either you run it on a schedule, which is what I think we did here. It was super common to run your elevator kind of on a timetable, like a subway car, because otherwise you either have to like wait for it to go by the right floor, or you have to shout up the elevator shaft and try to get somebody's attention to bring you the car, right? And I have included this snippet from the House Journal in 1903, and they're talking about, it's basically the legislature requesting that the Board of Auditors make the elevator run at certain times, especially during session. This comes up at a couple of different times in the Capitol's history, so it seems like they were trying to make sure that they had the elevator when they really needed it. And it's with all these issues, it's not surprising that the water elevator was upgraded pretty quickly. About 1899, the original elevator, the small one in that north hallway by the rotunda, it was electrified. And then in 1903, they install another larger elevator in the east hallway. This is the one that most people use because it's right in that front door. And it's a lot bigger. But even with the second elevator, there were still problems. It is electric, but it's still manually operated. You got to have somebody inside working a lever. And it was apparently also very noisy. The Otis company actually had to come back a year later in 1904 and install some extra pieces before the Board of Auditors would pay their final bill. And I did find one reference to the brakes actually failing on this elevator. And nobody's hurt in this incident. The car didn't actually fall that far, but still not something you necessarily want to experience. And the you might notice this article does say elevator tumbled again, which suggests that this may have been a reoccurring problem. So when you consider like how fiddly these elevators were, it makes the job of elevator operator a lot more complicated, right? This is a task that obviously requires some physical finesse and the availability and the ability to run a not very reliable machine and try to keep the people inside the machine calm and content while you're doing it. The first time I actually find elevator operators, or sometimes they call them elevator conductors, listed in our Board of Auditors reports. It's 1882. So you can see we've got an L.C. Hitchcock, who was paid for like 26 days of elevator operating that year. And unfortunately, when you've got these elevators, these early elevators, you just have a lot more contact with the actual machinery in the systems. And that could sometimes be really dangerous. We do know in 1901, one of our elevator operators, a J.B. Waldron, actually was very badly injured, somehow fell or was knocked over against the operating lever of the machine, and he really hurt his face and his leg, and he ended up dying a few weeks later. And so this is obviously a freak accident, right? This is the only time it happened as far as I know here, but it is a good reminder that with any new technology, there is going to be risk. And ultimately, it's not the people who are picking out these systems to go in the building who are going to face that risk. It's the people who are using them every day who are going to see those unintended consequences. Now, another potentially dangerous technology we had in our capital came in the form of the gaslighting. Just as the building commissioners were real confident that they wanted the steam heating, they also knew they needed gas lights. The only other option really at the time were kerosene or other burning oils in individual lamps. That was how the second Capitol was lit. And it was sometimes so dark that it forced the legislators to adjourn when it got too dark to see in the chambers. So clearly that situation has some issues. Gas lights are brighter, they're more convenient, but they do require a whole like infrastructure to produce and distribute the gas. And to be clear, the gas they're using at the time is coal gas. It is not natural gas. This is produced by heating coal inside a sealed chamber. It's called a gas retort. And then the gas is distilled and purified, which makes it burn cleaner and burn brighter. And then you'd store the gas in kind of a silo type structure called a gas holder or a gas meter. And from the storage, the gas could be distributed through piping, underground piping to buildings wherever you need it to be. The Lansing Gaslight Company didn't actually form till 1872, which is on the late side for any significant community at the time. And that's after the Capitol is already under construction. And we do actually have a postcard here where you can see where their gas plant was. It was the corner of Hill Street and Grand Avenue. And you can see those little silos. Those were their gas meters for the storage. According to an LSJ article, they started off with 5 miles of gas mains connected to 61 street lamps, 200 private residences, and of course the Capitol building. So with the source of a coal gas in the works, the State Board of Auditors could move on to actually finding fixtures, lighting fixtures for the new building. A couple members of the building commission were dispatched to East in March of 1878, basically to go chandelier shopping. And they eventually arrange a contract with Mitchell, Vance and Company of New York. This is one of the biggest lighting fixture companies in the country at the time. They had an enormous display at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition, which we know the commissioners went to. So I think you can imagine them doing a little window shopping here. This is their exhibit that you can see in the cool stereograph. Looks like a really fun version of like the lighting section at Home Depot. And this company offered an enormous variety of styles, from the most modest to the most elaborate fixtures. And we had both ends of that spectrum in this building. I've paired here some photos of our chandeliers with some images from their 1876 catalog that are kind of similar. They made our Michigan chandeliers in the corridors. They supplied the chamber chandeliers, and they also supplied these kind of rinky-dink, nothing to look at fixtures for the offices on the ground floor. Not everyone gets that much crystal, you know. So when they finished up this order, they arranged all these lighting fixtures to come in, which, by the way, included something like 271 chandeliers, pendants, and bracket type fixtures, containing a total of 1,702 individual gas burners or jets. And so the fixtures arrive in Lansing, again on an astounding number of train cars, and were installed by the Walton Williams Company of Ohio. This is the same company that actually installed all the gas piping and the steam pipes in the building, too. And of course, given the options for man-made lighting in Lansing at that time, or lack thereof, it's really no surprise that the Capitol's gas lights were very impressive. The lights were first turned on for a big test in December of 1878, and people showed up to watch. And once the Capitol's open and people are coming to see it, they're commenting on the lighting. I've included a couple of fun quotes here. This is from the opening, January 1st. Light glistened from every window and from lanterns from thousands of gas jets. It looked like a mountain of flame. And a month later, from the Lansing Republican, if you stand looking out of a front window of the House or Senate Hall at dusk when gas is lighted, the chandeliers in the ceiling may be seen reflected in the sky, presenting a sight too beautiful for description. But of course, creating this mountain of fire spectacle is not quite as easy as like flipping a switch. While the gas was piped directly into each fixture, most of our lights were not self-igniting. You had to bring the flame to the party yourself. And so that meant you needed a little tool called a torch and key. Included a couple of images here. And this is basically a tool on a stick. It's got a little clamp of some sort and some kind of ignition device. So you'd use your little clamp to turn the actual knob on each gas jet. Those were called gas keys or sometimes gas cocks. And once that gas is flowing, you light it. And sometimes these just had like a long taper candle. So you'd light that and then use that for your light, for your gas. Sometimes there was like a friction mechanism, almost like a lighter, so you get a little spark going. And of course, with a building as large as we do, with more than 1,000 gas burners to light, that is going to be a big job. And on top of that, gas lights also require a lot of maintenance. You need to clean the glass globes and the smoke bells regularly. You have to make sure the gas jets are functioning properly. And the people who are doing this maintenance of the chandeliers, these are going to be the Capitol's janitors and janitresses. This is an excerpt from the report of the Auditor Generals from 1891, and I've like highlighted where they list all the janitorial staff. It was men and women at the time, and so there's no question they're doing a really hard physical job, and potentially a dangerous one. Included on this list is an F.M. Montague, and according to several reports, in 1891, he was the victim of a gas explosion at the Capitol building. Evidently, he went into a storage area in the superintendent of public instruction's office where the gas light had been extinguished, but the gas valve had not been closed. And unfortunately, he was striking a match as he went in. So he gets blown back against the wall. The glass in the door of the room gets shattered, and he gets severe burns to his hands and his face. Luckily, he does survive this incident, as far as we know. But to add insult to injury, the state Republican published a humorous poem about his experience a few days later. I will not read the whole thing, but it does include the warning: before you enter the Capitol, you'd better stop and smell, which is good advice to anybody who's interested in getting into politics, I guess. So again, it's important to remember that behind all these technologies, there are people who have to make them function, and that is not always an easy task. As we've seen earlier with the elevator setup, what works on paper, what works in the mind of an engineer, it doesn't always work in real life. Sometimes that gets a little bit more complicated. And of course, the days of gas lights are numbered. But even before the light bulb was invented, we did have some electrical ignition systems on our chandeliers, including the lights inside of the dome. And I'm going to include a little photo that we took earlier. This is a photo we took at the top of the scaffolding in the rotunda of one of the gas jets up there. So this is what would have been inside a gas burner. There was probably some kind of reflector on the back to bounce the light downward, but there were rings of these at different levels all in the dome to create that mountain of fire look. So I just think it's cool to see a little forgotten piece of capital technology. All right, and I'm going to let Brian come up, talk a little bit more about how those really early electrics in the building worked.
Yeah, well done, Mike. So one of the issues with that gas jet at the top of the dome is that it's pretty impossible to get to on a day-to-day basis. So they had to come up with a way of lighting these up. So what they decided to do then was use this new thing called the battery. As the dawn of the 20th century approached, the thing that really drove the most change and advancement during this time period is the harnessing of electricity, right? Innovations left and right sprouted up, centered around the generating, capturing, and utilizing of electricity. And this was done primarily in two ways, either through mechanical force or through chemical reaction. When we talk about chemical reaction, we're talking about the galvanic battery. When we're talking about mechanical force, we're talking about steam engines and dynamos. Dynamos is the language of the time for generators, pretty much. I won't go into the full history of the battery, but by the 1970s, there's really only one type of battery being used, and it's called a wet cell battery. 1870s. Thank you. I didn't even catch that. 1870s, the wet cell battery. There were several different variations of a wet cell battery, but the most common was called a Leclanche cell. That's French. I don't know French. Leclanche cell, which consisted of a glass jar. Think of a mason jar of types. Inside of that jar, then, it was filled about halfway with a clear liquid, which was ammonium chloride. You can see it kind of filled up there halfway. Inside of this liquid sat a pot, kind of like a ceramic pot. The pot would have holes in it, so it made it a porous pot. And so the liquid could actually pass inside to the contents inside the pot. Inside the pot, there was a dark black, almost like a gravel coalish material. It was actually a mixture of manganese dioxide and carbon powder. And then sticking out of the pot up top was a large plate that went all the way to the bottom of this pot of a zinc. It was a zinc plate. And then sitting outside of that pot in the ammonium chloride was a carbon rod. And so simply put, if anybody knows electricity at all, so the carbon would act as the positive, cathode. Does that sound right? Anybody know that? Positive cathode?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the zinc plate would act as the negative cathode. And then the manganese dioxide acted as a depolarizer. So if anybody got that, props to you. But simply put, this mason jar full of metal created electricity. It actually created about 1.4 volts of electricity. Does anybody know what our Duracell battery at home gives off? 1.5 volts. So this was pretty effective, right? With what we have today, pretty comparable. There were variations of this Leclanche cell, like I said. One that we think was used in the Capitol quite often was the Grenay cell, which was pretty much the same thing in a fancier jar with 3 carbon rods and 2 zinc plates. So the Leclanche had 1 of each, and then the Grenay had 3 carbons and 2 zinc. And simply put, this was a little bit stronger. It could give up to about 2.2 volts compared to the 1.4 of the Leclanche cell. Probably approximately. Yeah. Yeah. From what I've seen, I watch videos on YouTube of people who find these in their attic tucked away and I have no idea what this is. So what I've seen of the little conch shell, it's just about like that. Yep. And then the grenade, I think a little bit taller than that. So these were, of course, kind of difficult to work with because it was an open jar of liquid. So it sloshed around a bit. So you couldn't really mass produce it. You couldn't really ship it, right? You couldn't put it inside a cabinet. You're kind of careful handling it. So the wet cell quickly becomes replaced in the early 1900s with the dry cell battery, one of which we have here. This is probably one from the 1930s or so. But the big one that comes out first is the Columbia dry cell. That's in the late 1890s. It comes out. Simply put, this is those wet cells just contained. Instead of it being a pure liquid form, instead it's like a wet paste inside of it. So this simply made using batteries a lot easier than it had been prior, and it makes it a lot more common too. So the reason why that we're going so deep into batteries is that they did use batteries to actually spark up some of the gas fixtures we had in the building. The wet cells were quickly put in use in the Capitol. They were used to power the clock system, these things called annunciators, telegraphs, telephones, all of which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But another system of vital importance was the lighting. Edison perfected the light bulb just a few months after the Capitol opened up. Really bad timing because they had fitted the entire building for gas lighting. Think about 13,000 feet of gas piping through the building that they had to find out how to reuse with electricity later on. But when you think of inside the Capitol, one thing you probably picture is big spaces, right? 22-foot high corridors, 50-foot tall chambers, 160-foot rotunda, huge dome up top. And as May talked about, a lot of this was lit for the first time. It was just a breathtaking sight, right? That mountain of fire that May talked about. But what comes with these big spaces, though, is very hard to reach light fixtures. So what the building commission decided to do, the commission who oversaw the building of the Capitol, was to make a battery room up on the third floor of the Capitol. We think this room was probably a smaller room off of the rotunda. We don't know exactly. It doesn't show up in the plans or drawings at all. But what we do have about this room is from a newspaper article from the state Republican at the time that went really in depth into this reporter's experience of walking into this battery room and finding this magic cabinet of sorts. And so I'll read this off and kind of explain what this looked like. So let's see where I am. So it says that the battery room with batteries inside of it were used to light fixtures in the rotunda. It ran wires to the attics of the House and Senate chambers, the Supreme Court room, the state library, and of course the different levels of the dome all the way to the lantern at the top of the building. Electric current would produce flames on the chamber chandeliers, as well as single burner lights that were in the ceiling above the chamber glass tiles up above. And it made it all possible by lighting these all on just a flick of a switch. So what made this possible was the wet cell battery in this battery room. The Capitol electrician, Mr. Briley, controlled a magic cabinet, possibly of his own creation. Those are my words, it's not in the article. But the cabinet was constructed of wood. It was 7 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and 15 inches deep. A shelf within the cabinet held 2 or 3 of the grenade batteries. See them up there. So this is my shelf that I made in Microsoft Paint. So you can see the cells. When you connected these cells together by a wire, you would multiply the voltage of them. So remember, these grenades were 2.2 volts. So putting 2 together, 4.4. So from here, they ran a wire, and this wire would connect to the different spaces of the building. A shelf, yep. Connected by wire, they produced enough charge to light around 150 gas lights in 3 seconds. Below the battery shelf, on the front face of the cabinet, were several marble dials that resembled clock faces. So these were gauges. Upon the dials were knobs assigned to different areas of the building. talking about these right here. So these knobs were assigned to different spaces in the building. Inside of the knobs were two little hands, such as on a clock, and these could be turned to each one of these knobs. Okay. Below these dials then were keys. We don't know how many keys, but think of these almost as they were either buttons that you could press or they were keys that you'd turn. Not sure which one. But these ones would then set off, where is it? Inductive coils. And so this worked that if you pointed both of the hands at one of the knobs at a specific room you wanted lit, and then you turned the appropriate key for that room down below, then it would spark it. And the gas would be told to flow to this room, and the spark then would go to that actual gas burner that you wanted lit. So this all utilized a patent that came out in 1858 by a Mr. S. Gardner Jr. So what we're looking at here is an actual gas burner, almost like a Bunsen burner, right? And then along that, you have these two wires, these two small letter A's that go up to each end. Up top is a coil, and the wire would come back down to the next gas fixture. And so once this was lit, that would actually spark up enough where it would ignite the flame. So pretty ingenious. This system was actually tested by S. Gardner Jr. in the US Capitol in their Senate chamber in 1858, and it successfully lit up 1,500 gas lights within 2 seconds time. The US Capitol decided not to use it because it was going to be very costly for them. Don't know how much it was going to cost, but they decided it was a little bit too much. So they went with just all gas lights instead for the time being. But I think folks around the Capitol must have heard about that, and it influenced what they thought about. So the early success, though, of the Capitol's battery room must have had people in the Capitol kind of clamoring for more, because around the mid 1880s, we have discussions about these new things called electric light bulbs. So the first public building in the world to be lit using electric light bulbs was the Savoy Theatre in London, and it utilized the Edison lamp, the incandescent light bulb, to light up their entire theater. And they ran shows that first year. They had a little bit of problem here and there, but for the most part, it was a pretty big spectacle. People would come in and see the electric lights along the balcony. They would use lights, powerful arc lamps as spotlights on stage. So it was a huge thing. They were able to do this because the Savoy Theatre constructed what was called a light plant at their location. It was either in the basement of the theater or in a shed out back. Inside of this light plant, there was two main components. There was that steam engine, and there was a dynamo, a generator, set of generators. In order to operate the steam engine, which would have been this big thing up here, they burned coal for it, and the coal would give off steam. The steam would go into a cylinder with a piston. The piston would rise and fall. That would make that would create the pressure, and then from there that was used to turn or drive a crankshaft. From there, they would use belts connected to a dynamo, and simply put, the dynamo was a collection of metal coils that were within a magnetic field. And by turning, rotating those coils using the belt, from the mechanical energy produced, then that would make EMFs, electromotive forces. And so from that, simply put, you get electricity, right? So this is turning mechanical energy into electricity. So the Savoy Theatre actually built their own little plant, right? Their own little power plant for their structure. We don't have too many records of where else these light plants were built at, but they were pretty often, or they show up a lot during the 1880s. Another building that built their own light plant was actually the U.S. Capitol in the mid 1880s. Nothing is known. I contacted the architect of the Capitol, and they didn't have too much to share about it, but the architect at that time of the building in the mid 1880s actually built a light plant for their building. So all this to say that it has people in Michigan probably daydreaming a little bit about what the future could be. So Yeah, so as rumors of electric plant systems began to spread, it had folks in the capital daydreaming of a system of their own. Some started to argue that while gas lighting was well established and available, it was not without fault, and it was growing quite costly. On the floor, on the floor of the Senate in the spring session of 1885, Senator James Belknap, a two-term Republican from Greenville, gave a rousing speech in favor of new electric lighting over gas lighting. The spark notes of which I'll walk you through here. So from 1883 to 1884, gas to the building cost $2.50 per 1,000 feet. And that came out to about $4,279 a year. Okay. That doesn't include the depreciation of the gas piping and all the cleaning and repair work that May discussed with the gas lighting. 921 gas lights at the time were equal to about 691 incandescent light bulbs. These were 16 candle powers, how they measured the power of the light. So 16 candle hour light bulbs. Each lamp required 87 horsepower per hour. Horsepower was generated by the dynamos in the engines, and they were powered by burning coal. It took 5 pounds of coal to generate 1 horsepower, which totals 435 pounds of coal per day for each gas light, right? And that equals about $1.19 per day, or about $434 a year. It was common during this period to actually recycle the steam exhaust for the heating and use it for ventilation of the building. So this could actually drive down the cost of the coal that we see up there, the $434. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Yeah. So one bulb at the time cost 85 cents. And they figured with the total number of light bulbs burning out in a year, that would bring the total replacement cost for a year at about $122 for the building. Factoring in the depreciation of the engines and the dynamos, a full-time electrician to handle the lights, the oil and the waste management produced, it will total around $2,631 for the new electric lighting, compared to that $4,279 for the gas lighting, right? So you can see there's a cost benefit there. Another immeasurable benefit on top of that is kind of the environmental impact of the building. With the gas lighting, 5,527 cubic feet of gas entered the building each day. And while May mentioned with that, with the gas plant, right, that it was filtered, it was cleaned and made brighter, it was still coal gas, right? There's only so much you could do, especially in the 1870s, 1880s. So what this meant that was with all this gas lighting, you had free carbon particles. You had smoke soot going every single surface of the building, destroying the artwork over the time, and it was not healthy at all. In fact, the one gas burner was equal to the exhalations of 8 people. So if you're feeling a little lightheaded, that would be why in the early days of the Capitol, right? So it might not have been a big coincidence at this time that in 1883 and 1885, when these discussions are going on, Ohio's rival to the South, Ohio, actually began to electrify their state house. They were one of the first state houses to electrify. Not sure if they had their own capital light plant that I talked about earlier for their building or how they did it exactly. But again, this had people thinking, right? This was possible. It's even possible that members from the Michigan legislature made a trip down to Columbus in 1885 to check out what they had going on there and brought it back. Eventually, Belknap's proposal for a capital light plant at this time was tabled because there was a big cost that was missing. Does anybody know what cost was missing from all this? Installation, right? The buying of the engines, generators, they put it about $30,000 to do that. So he conveniently left it out of his big speech, but it was going to be a huge cost to do this. So that's why they tabled it. But nevertheless, this was enough to start the discussion of electrifying the Capitol. And it would end up being about a 20-year process to do it. Beginning around 1882, found this really cool portion from the Board of State Auditors report where they actually paid the state printers, W.S. George there, for 8 labels for electric lights. And that's all the info we have on that. But I like to imagine as a exhibit maker, right, that they had some new electric lights in the Capitol and they wanted to show them off. So they actually did like a light exhibit with labels that they made. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it shows that we had electric lights 1882, which is way before we thought earlier. In 1885, there's a newspaper report that says they laid about 15,000 feet of wire for new electric lighting in the Capitol. They had about 300 bulbs that were in use every single night. The 24 lamps in the rotunda illuminated. So this would have been with that battery room with those grenade cells. Throughout the 1880s, 1890s, we have a growing sense of electric light bulbs in the building. In 1890, we start to see electric lights listed under the duties of the Capitol engineer. And that same year, there were 2 electric lamp posts put on the far northeast and southeast corners of Capitol Square. And this was actually a joint venture with the city, where Lansing paid for one of them and the state paid for the other. But again, it was a way to show off these new electric light systems. By 1894, there was quite a steady stream of electricity going into the Capitol and this old state office building that was at the corner of Washington and Allegan. And they actually started renting out lights too, for some of their rooms, such as you can see these lights that hang down. Those were called drop lights. So it's reported that some of these might have been rented out, so not permanent fixtures in the Capitol. Not really sure how that worked exactly. And a lot of these lights they were using were Thomson Houston light bulbs, which were a manufacturing arm of the Edison light bulb pretty much. So we had a lot of these in the Capitol. The only problem though in the 1890s is that the lighting was quite terrible. I think it was just a matter that they had put all this wiring in mid 1880s, and they just weren't able to get a good flow of electricity to it by their provider. Their earlier provider, I believe, had been the Board of Waterworks and Electric Supply Commission. And the lighting was so bad, especially in the chambers, that in 1897, the House put out sort of an ultimatum where they said, unless the Board of Waterworks and Electric Supply could up the voltage to the building each day, they would either install dangerous electric arc lamps, which were lamps that were meant purely for outside because they were very dangerous and quite troublesome, or they would just scrap electricity altogether and go completely back to gas lighting. In the end, they decided to go all or nothing. They got rid of the border water lights, and they went instead with the more local supply from the Lansing Electric Light and Power Company. And they began rewiring the Capitol in the late 1890s. And by 1905, they had done enough for the building, and they had got enough electricity going to it that they were able to light the entire dome exterior with the bird cage lighting that would stay on the building for quite a while. So what a better way to symbolize electricity. We've made it, right, than by lighting up the entire dome with over 800 light bulbs. Yes, Steve? So it was all DC. Thanks for asking. So all this was DC current, so direct current, which was good for low energy, right? And then once you get into the 1900s, that's when AC currents come available, and then it takes over. So we don't see much of DC after that. Yeah, thanks for asking. So any questions? Any other questions? Okay. Yes. Yes. So it was in total, they had gas lighting up until about 1900. So it was 1879 to 1900. And part of this too that I don't cover here is that you don't cover it either, fixtures that had both.
Oh, yeah, but we did have some.
So we had fixtures in the building that actually were called transition fixtures that had both gas burning and new light bulbs on them as well. And so if you ever go into the chambers, House and Senate chambers, the fixtures that hang down from the galleries, the sides, those are transition fixtures. The globes that point up was for the gas to burn up, and then globes point down for the light bulbs to shine down. So we think in the chambers, they installed those in the early 1890s. Before that, they had huge, we think they at least tested, or we know they at least tested carbon arc lamps, which we don't cover here either. Think of the most terrifying lamppost you can think of ever.
Lamppost with a literal like lightning bolt inside.
Yep.
Like,
And it was it was so loud that it hummed. So they hung it from the ceiling, it would hum. The light flickered and it could just blow up at any second. So they didn't go with that.
Yeah.
Exactly. Less mosquitoes for anybody who missed that. Get that in there.
Behind the Capitol, built in 1908, and it had gas fireplaces that were just a asbestos base on it.
Yeah.
But it had electric lights,
Okay.
the things on it. So they had the house, and there were 2 or 3 competing gas and electric companies in Lansing.
Yeah.
That would furnish your home.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a few, competing companies for gas and for electric in the early days. And I'm not sure exactly when the Lansing Board of Water and Light kind of won out. It's like as a municipally supplied company, and then after that, all the other companies who wanted to market their supplies in Lansing had to actually get like a franchise license to do that, which made it more expensive. So yeah, I'm not sure when that kind of settled down and everyone kind of sort of got the same supplies in their homes. But yeah, it's interesting to think about those different combinations of the tech at different times. Yep. Oh yeah, Steve. DC to
For the
AC.
Capitol itself, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yep. I don't know for the building itself, but I know it's the 1890s.
Yeah.
Late 1890s.
Yeah, from direct current to alternating, 1890s. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
The installation of the gas, like, it's interesting that they were coming out of Ohio.
Yeah. The Ohio company that put the gas piping in was probably the cheapest. And they obviously they installed the piping first. And then with all those in place, the fixtures could just be added in later. And it was actually the Mitchell Vance company that worked with that Ohio company to say, yes, you can put our chandeliers in the building. So I assume they were the ones actually like hanging all those little crystals and lifting them up to the ceiling. Yeah.
And the gentleman who ran the Lansing Gas Company, he was Eugene Cooley. He had actually petitioned to get the bid to supply the fixtures and the piping for the building, but he came in over cost. So it was probably purely a cost.
Yeah.
So they were
Darn Ohioans. All right. So we'll go on. We'll get some more questions at the end. Talking about these early electric systems and the early battery systems, one of the other things that the batteries powered, besides the gas light ignition, were the clocks. And obviously, clocks seem like such an obvious thing to have in a working office building, but in the late 19th century, just the concept of standardized time was still taking shape. The US did not have like standard official time zones till 1883. Before that, there were over 144 local times used in different spots in North America. That sounds incomprehensible to us, but before train travel, which enabled people to move long distances in a relatively short amount of times, it's just not as important. Most people were still living their lives on a pretty local or maybe a regional scale where everybody they interacted with are seeing the sun at a relatively the same spot in the sky. But once we're interacting across much longer distances, that becomes really important to agree on what time it is, and especially that the government knows what time it is. So the Board of State building commissioners start taking bids for a clock system in the building in 1878. In their proposal, they are quite specific that they want multiple wall clocks that are attached to one regulator or master clock, which would be powered by the battery in the basement. They also specify that a warranty will be required that the clock will not exceed 10 seconds of variation in the month. So eventually they contract with Howard and Co. company out of Boston to install what they were calling a system of electric clocks that included like the regulator clock and dials for the chambers, the House and Senate, the Supreme Court, the state library, and for the principal offices, they call them. I'm basically guessing everybody who wasn't on the ground floor of the building got a clock. And so with this system, the regulator or master clock would be wired to all the other clocks on the walls, and that you could synchronize your time really easily that way. Now, I am not sure if the Board of Auditors got that warranty because by March of 1879, there were already complaints about the timekeeping. This is from the Senate Journal, and there's a senator basically complaining about the irregularity of the clocks in the building and suggesting that they all be set to Detroit time and then reset every morning to correct any differences. A few years later, this little snippet's from the State Republican in 1886. I wish to call attention to the want of care given to the Capitol clock. The state at large purchased an expensive clock, but for some reason, it keeps no better time than a $5 clock. It is rarely closer than 3 or 4 minutes to the correct time. This is, however, generally in favor of the employees. We have a clock like that in our office, too. And in 1907, the clocks were updated with storage batteries, which were kind of an earlier version of a rechargeable battery, I guess, which maybe improved the system. And there were a lot of other clocks in the building that were not connected to the master regulator clock, and a lot that came in and out of the building over the years. Today, we kind of have a mixture of original and reproduction wall clocks here and there, but we do still have the old regulator clock. This is on the first floor in the east hallway. It's right across the elevator if you ever want to go up and see it. It's nice to still have it there. It's been repaired many times through the years, but it's very cool to see the machine that, you know, kind of used to set the pace for daily life in the building. And so I think the clocks are kind of a piece of communication that we all, you know, agree on what time it is and what's going on. And I'm going to ask Brian to come back up and talk a little bit more about these communications techs in the Capitol.
So starting with communication, we'll start kind of primitive with speaking tubes. Has anybody not seen a speaking tube before? Okay, so speaking tubes, also commonly known as voice pipes, are made up, it's very complex. It's made up of 2 mouthpieces and a metal tube. The tube is run through a wall to connect a user in one room to a user in another room. The mouthpiece doubles as a listening device and, of course, a piece to speak into. The mouthpiece was often funnel shaped to better direct the sound. It was often metallic or ceramic for the very fancy ones, and could be either directly attached to a wall or set on the end of a flexible tube that came off from the wall. So you could kind of walk around with it a little bit. The speaking tube was mostly used in affluent houses, of course, to call servants in the rooms at the bottom or back of the house up to the rooms at the top. Early aviation, you've probably seen where gunners will speak to the pilot in front using a tube. Chauffeured cars that had a passenger partition, they could speak to the driver from the passenger seats in the back, and places of businesses and offices. Though today, interchange, the use of voice pipes as a term was reserved for naval and maritime use. For ships and subs would use voice pipes, and then anywhere on land or in the air, we would use speaking tubes. It's the proper term. So here you can see a catalog of the different parts of the speaking tube. So the mouthpiece and the pipe, that's about it. So a key piece to the speaking tube was an alert feature, so that a user on one end could actually alert a user on another end that they wanted to speak, right? Because it wasn't the loudest noise coming out of the tube. This was done in one of 2 ways. The speaking tube would either have a whistler or a flag, or it would have both. A whistler was a round disc within the mouthpiece that could be moved aside with a spring lever. So here's looking at the front of the mouthpiece that you would speak into or listen into. This piece in the center is kind of like a trumpet mute. You know what a trumpet mute looks like? And then you could use your thumb to move this lever. That would move the whistler down and open up the pipe that you can then either listen clearly through or talk clearly through. Now, the reason why there was a whistler is that the user on one end could actually move their whistler out of the way, blow into the tube, the air would pass through the tube, and then the pressure would make the whistle sound on the other end of the tube. So if you were in your office working, you heard a whistle, then you knew that somebody wanted to talk to you, right? And the other alert system was the flag. So this one happens to have both systems. So this little thing here, that's a little metal flag. It's covering up a hole. So the pressure then would also lift up this flag. So if you weren't in the room to hear a whistle at the time, when you came back to the room, you would see that the flag had been raised and that hopefully somebody was still on the other end that you could then whistle to, right? So it was generally considered a pretty effective communication tool for what it was, right? It had an effective distance of up to 300 feet of piping, though the usual tube ran about 50 to 100 feet. We know that speaking tubes were used in the early days of the Capitol, though information is very sparse. From the 1879 Journal of the Senate, we know that the Waite and Williams Company of Toledo, who did the gas lighting installation, was actually hired to install the speaking tubes between the principal offices of the building at a cost of $305. The only other recorded appropriation is from an 1879 same Journal of the Senate, where they installed a sliding closet and a speaking tube into the Auditor General's office for $56. So I'm not sure if this was like a private speaking tube with a slider, like a phone booth where you could go in and have a private conversation through the speaking tube. I'm not sure, but that's the only other record we have of it being installed. Besides for these two appropriations, though, we have two more fun pieces of evidence for speaking tubes. One is photo evidence, as a mouthpiece on a flexible tube and a flag can be seen in an 1893 photo from the Superintendent of Public Instruction's office. If you can see it, it's over here by the lights. Oh, I'm kind of blocking the way. Let's see if I can move that. There we go. So I've outlined it here. So from this wall, you can see there's a little flag system, and then there's a flexible tube that comes down, and there is the mouthpiece kind of looking at you there. So that is photo evidence of a speaking tube, and that's about all we have as far as photo evidence goes. Because it's hard to see here, this is another photo I've seen online. This is from a bar with a barmaid kind of talking into a speaking tube. It looks a lot like the one that we have in our photo here. Even more fun evidence is a portion of speaking tube piping. This was found by our longtime Capitol mechanic, Mark McEwen. I'm not sure exactly when he found it or where he found it. It was within a wall of the Capitol. He would find things and keep them and research them in his own time because he was very curious and knowledgeable. So this is a portion of brass piping. So it looks a lot like we had in the catalog. So pretty confident to say that. So it's not often that we have artifacts from these early systems, but we're going to treasure it when we have it and show it off. So that's one of my favorite systems, is the speaking tubes. So hopefully one day we can get those back in some way or fashion. Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. Yep. Just a more fancy medium we're talking through. Let me get this back. Here we are. Another early form of communication we had in the building that actually utilized those early batteries were annunciators and bell systems. Annunciators often used in old hotels. These were used to call janitors, engineers to specific portions of the building. So one room would have an electric button that they could press. Sometimes it was a floor key where they would press it with their foot. Sometimes it was a fancier button on a desk that they could press with their finger. This would actually just make a circuit. It would go to another room with an annunciator box. Once they press the button on one end, the flag for this end would spike up toward whatever room needed attention. So in the Capitol, we know that the principal spaces, again, in the Capitol had these annunciators, and that they were used to call the attention of janitors and engineers who worked on the ground floor of the building and down in like the boiler room areas as well. So again, a very simple form of communication, right? So it's pressing a button and hope somebody on the other end hears it or sees it and can come assist you. So while it sounds very primitive, this is still, of course, a technology we use today in the Capitol itself. Mute it again. There we go. If you recognize these from the chambers, these are our House page boards. And these are page buttons used at each one of the representatives' desks. So during session, especially if it's Rule 52, Rule 52, 53, 32, Rule 32 is enacted where the representatives aren't allowed to leave their desks unless it's for an emergency. If they need to pass a note outside to constituents in the lobby, or if they need assistance, if something's not working at their desk, they can call House pages who can then come to their desk. Once they press their white page button, their desk number will show up on the page board. It will light up. And so the pages in the back of the chamber know to go to the specific desk. So pretty reminiscent of the early communication systems we had. This is a session bell. This was up in the first floor north corridor for quite a long time. It was installed around the 1930s, we think, and taken out around the Restoration in the early 90s. So if you're in the Capitol on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the spring and the fall, and you hear bells going off in the hallways, that's alerting representatives, senators, they need to hurry up and get to session. Usually rings 15 minutes before, but a very, very simple bell system, right? Just like a school bell.
Are the pages assigned to a certain senator or rep, or they just line up, the next one starts running?
Yep. Yeah, usually they'll be at either the back of the chamber or out in the lobby. So if there are lobbyists in the hallways or constituents looking to meet with a representative or senator, they'll hand a note to a page. Page will run that in. Then the representatives can come out into the lobby and meet them. Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Very good. And then as communication evolved and technology evolved, of course, we get the telephone. Brief history of the telephone. Invented by Alexander Graham Bell. He was Scottish born. He was a scientist and a teacher. He was awarded the patent for the telephone in 1876. So remember, the Capitol opens 1879. So keep that in mind. His first successful test of the telephone came on March 10th of 1876, when he famously spoke the words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," to his assistant, Thomas Watson, who was in another room. And from there, they would change the world. Telephones introduced to the Capitol in 1881. At this time, telephones and their lines were rented through utility companies, many of which specialized in brand new telephone system and slightly more established telegram systems. So a lot of times you would have telephones and telegrams installed and run by the same companies. It is believed, based on more photo evidence from that same picture, that the early telephones in the Capitol were Western Electric 3-box Blake transmitter telephones. So those Western Electric 3-box Blake transmitter telephones, one of which you can see right over here. And if you look closely, it matches pretty well with the telephone we have up on the wall there. So we don't have record that these were Western Electric telephones other than me matching those two photos together. Western Electric was a main manufacturing arm of the American Bell Telephone Company, the company that was founded by Alexander Graham Bell. During the 1880s and 1890s, the American Bell Telephone Company was one of the two major phone companies in the nation, the other being the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, better known as AT&T, still around today. AT&T would purchase the Bell Company in 1899. While Bell had effectively invented the telephone, his phones had a shortcoming when compared to the AT&T phones, in that it had a very weak microphone system. So to rectify this system, or rectify this problem, the Bell telephone became synonymous with the Blake transmitter. Invented by Francis Blake in the 1870s, this box, when attached to a telephone, amplified the speech of the user. I thought I had a picture of one. Oh, there we are. I skipped that one. So this right here in the middle, this box sticking out, that is the Blake transmitter. And this is a look inside of it. So what this was a speech amplifier. It was a more powerful microphone that the Bell company then kind of contracted with to make their phones usable, essentially. So they came synonymous with each other. The Capitol began in 1881 by renting 3 phones with public lines from the local telephone and telegraph, or not local, the Telephone and Telegraph Construction Company of Detroit, which was a major supplier of Bell telephones in the state of Michigan. And these were rented on a subscription fee. So every month you would pay this fee to the company to rent out the phones and to kind of reserve your own line. We know that these 3 phones were rented out for the offices of the governor, auditor general, and board of auditors. A telephone office was installed in the Capitol in January of 1885 and was then connected to all the state offices all over the state. As more people started getting phones around Michigan then, the more demand came to the Capitol for assistance and phone calls. It got to the point that in the 1890s, the president of, sorry, I lost my spell a little bit. Completely lost my mind. Sorry about that. In 1897, the president of the board of, sorry. We're gonna skip that. Telephones grew in usage in the Capitol. And it got to the point that so many people were calling the Capitol that local companies who were renting out phones to the building were coming to the Capitol and demanding that the Capitol installed their own lines and bought their own permanent telephones. So we see this that by 1904, the list of offices using telephones had grown exponentially. You can then look in city directories and see that each major office in the Capitol has phones. So over a period of roughly 20 years, the usage of phones in the Capitol grows from about 3 offices up to 20 plus, right? So just giving you an idea of, how fast technology kind of took off in the Capitol, but there were definitely some growing pains that went along with it. So with that, I'll turn it over to May.
Thanks, Brian. So speaking tubes, telephones, these are obviously providing some new ways of verbal communication, but there are also big changes to written communication coming in as well. And that's especially important in the Capitol. Governments run on paperwork. And this is an era of increasing record keeping and documentation. And when the Capitol first opens, most of that paperwork being produced in the building, it's going to be handwritten. But luckily, typewriters are just on the horizon. This was the first commercially successful typewriter. It was introduced by the Remington Company in the 1870s, and it was also displayed at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition. You can tell because there's a Union shield painted on the cover, very patriotic. These early models are very expensive. This is like $100 per machine, but obviously they have the advantage of speed and accuracy and the ability to produce duplicate documents. And when you look at the machines themselves, there's a lot of familiar pieces here. Typewriters lasted a really long time. And even on our modern computers, we're still using the same keyboard layout. This QWERTY keyboard was designed so that the letters that were often used together when you're writing in English, they're further apart. And that way the actual metal striking pieces inside the machine don't get tangled up so much as you're using the keys. So typewriters kind of work their way into law offices, banks, businesses, and eventually government offices. Here's that photo again. This is a super useful picture. You could actually see a woman in here using a typewriter. I found some really similar models. This is called a calligraph. It's just a different company. And on these, you can see these on the back of the machine, you can see these really interesting kind of very long metal legs. These early models were called upstrike typewriters. So those keys would actually swing up and forward and would print on the back side of your paper. So early typists had to be very confident in what they were writing because they couldn't actually see it until they were done. And that was the standard die until 1897. Now, another piece of technology used kind of in conjunction with typewriters were mimeographs. This is a machine that essentially makes a stencil of a written document that can be used to reprint multiple copies. The first mimeographs were developed in the 1880s specifically to work with a thing called an electric pen, which was a very fun Edison invention. This is like a metal stylus with a needle in the end of it, and you would connect it to one of Brian's batteries, and the needle would move up and down as you wrote and would punch tiny holes in your piece of paper. So you basically get lines of writing in perforations. Electric pens really only took off for tattoo artists, but mimeographs do stick around because you could also make mimeograph stencils with like waxed paper and a typewriter. And once you got your stencil made, this is a really early mimeograph, it's like little case design. You'd put it into a printing frame with a fresh sheet of paper underneath it and use this hand roller to apply ink over top of the stencils, and you would deposit the ink through those perforations. Later models had like cranks on the end so you could work it a little faster. And of course, then they get electrified as well. And mimeographs last a really long time because it's faster than typing multiple documents, but it's also just a really simple and inexpensive machine. So they're used by like small scale publications, schools, businesses, private use well into the 20th century. Just curious, anybody ever use a mimeograph in here? Yes. And they only start to be replaced by photocopiers in like the 60s and 70s. And I don't know when the very first typewriters and mimeographs come into the Capitol, but by the time they're doing the building inventory in 1891, there were at least 12 typewriters in the building, along with typewriter accoutrement, stands, desks, tables. The Supreme Court had several typewriters, this makes sense, and so did the other kind of big departments. But this was not just the most big or like powerful offices. The Board of Charities had a typewriter, so did the Labor Bureau. There was only one mimeograph on that list, which was being used in the Superintendent of Public Instruction's office, which makes sense if you came to our tour back in February. That office was printing a lot of little educational leaflets that were being sent around the state. So I assume they got a lot of use out of that mimeograph. And we are lucky to have a few early photos of these workspaces in the Capitol. And if you look who's actually using machines, what do they have in common? They're all women. Before the late 19th century, it is mostly men working in offices. But as businesses and governments are growing, there's just a greater demand for clerical workers. And so these machines are coming in at the same time where office work is becoming increasingly feminized. Women are getting some more educational opportunities at this point, but are still restricted out of a lot of areas of employment. So because they had fewer options than men did, they were often cheaper to employ. And a lot of employers also assumed that women would not expect the same kind of opportunities for advancement out of like typing and very simple clerical work, because they assumed that these women are only working till they get married, until they have kids. They're only working after their husband dies and they're widows. So at the turn of the 20th century, it's increasingly women who are getting hired to use these jobs in these offices with these technologies. The 1870 census recorded 7 women stenographers. By 1920, there were 500,000. And according to bring it back into our building, the 1879 Auditor General's report lists about 70 women who are working in our building. By 1910, that's closer to 170. And this shift in the office spaces, it is causing quite a bit of discourse about these women coming into these environments. This article is from 1899 and it's discussing the fastest typewriters in Lansing. At that time, typewriter referred to both the machine and the person using it. And they mention men as well as women in here, but they do note that a Miss Etta Caldwell of the State Banking Commissioner's Office and Miss Frank Lawler of the Attorney General's Office are very accurate, neat, and remarkable Swift typewriters. And the advantage that these two got by working in the Capitol is that the Michigan government paid their male and female clerks at the same rate. So obviously, these kind of mimeographs, typewriters, this gives you a nice written form of communication, but obviously you might still have to find the person you need to give that to. You might need to still put it in the mail. So I'm going to ask Brian to come up and talk a little bit more about a much quicker form of written communication.
I wanted to, I just want to touch briefly upon telegraphy. But truth be told, there's not a lot from the Capitol history that we have regarding it. So this is a quick shout out for it. Part of it was the fact that all of these other Capitol technologies were sort of newer to the building. Telegraphy was something that was well established, and so it wasn't noted as much in these papers about this new fancy Capitol going up, because it was kind of old fashioned. Even so, we don't have a lot of evidence from the first couple of years. What we do know is that in 1883, a Western Union branch office opened in the Capitol up in the West Wing outside of the State Library. And it was open to the members of the House and Senate during session hours. So they could communicate back through the districts pretty easily. While most of telegraphy utilized the Morse code, named after Samuel Morse, who is credited with the invention of telegraphy in the 1840s. Western Union actually created their own coding language because they were founded as more of a money moving company. Their code was more tailored toward like transactions and stats and coordinates and numbers, whereas Morse code was more tailored toward traditional text messages. So it's easy to think that people working in the Capitol dealing both with transactions and business, but also communicating with constituents back home, they were probably utilizing a lot of different codes in their techniques. But if you guys have any questions at all about telegrams, okay, we'll get up to the end here. So May and I just hope that this program revealed that the Capitol opened right on the cusp of a lot of societal and technological change. And within several years of the Capitol opening, for instance, in 1879, both the telephone and light bulb were invented, leading to countless new ways to harness electricity and rethink the way people thought and communicated and just saw the world around them. And more established technologies that the building was built around quickly became antiquated, right? Some were replaced very quickly, such as speaking tubes for telephones, while others stuck around for a long, long time, such as steam heat, which we had up until just a few years ago with our geothermal system now. So it's easy to imagine that this pressure on the brand new Capitol to adapt and change very rapidly caused the Capitol a lot of growing pains over the years. Heck, by 1903, there were calls for a large expansion of the building. By 1922, people were calling for a new building entirely. So while the Capitol was in a prime spot to be a showpiece, a leader for the state in these new changes, it also meant that they needed to be the first to go through that brick wall, which, you know, can be hard. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Any final questions, anything you wanted to share at all? No, I want to thank you very much for all coming today. Yeah.
One thing that maybe think that maybe they started installing light bulbs higher up in the building earlier? Like, did they kind of work down?
I think it all goes in at the same time, because the battery room, there was one article that said battery rooms. There was another article that said battery room. So what I believe is that there is probably one small space with that magic cabinet with the batteries. And from there, that controlled the chamber lighting, the Supreme Court lighting, the library lighting, and the rotunda lighting too.
That gets really confusing because in the period documents, sometimes they will call it an electric light, even if it's just a gas light with an electrical ignition.
So yeah, so I don't know if I don't know if that's a system they had from day one, and that's how they're lighting the rotunda, or if they had another system before that in the first couple years, and then it goes in the early 1880s, or if they just didn't light the rotunda for the first couple years because there was no paint to show off because the building wasn't painted until the mid 80s, anyways. So, but, yeah.
Were there ever any times when they did complain about this building? It's just too hot or this building is too cold?
Yes.
Yes.
So
I'm going to let Brian talk about the complaints about the heating system.
so there was one huge complaint that came out from the House chamber in the 1880s, or actually the 1890s, where a representative came out and said that there was no ventilation whatsoever, to the fact where he was convinced that they hadn't actually turned on the ventilators in the ceilings for the chamber itself. It was so stagnant, so hot, so stuffy, right? So they called in an architect to look at the chamber specifically, the House chamber, and he made the recommendation that the ventilators are working, but there's just not enough of them. So there was grills in the floor for air to come up through the floor, but he found that a lot of the grills were covered up by desks, so those aren't going to work. He found that in order to add more ventilation to the room, they needed to add those grill units that May talked about underneath the windows. They needed to add them up on the front wall to each side of the rostrum. And he also said that the House chamber, the foul air shaft, ran underneath the floor of the room. And that shaft was also the shaft for all the rooms on the first floor below. And so he found that as hot air rose into that shaft, it was taking priority over the air in the House chamber. And so as that air moved under the House chamber over towards where the elevator would go in later, behind the chamber, he found that that shaft was so full of air from the first floor that second floor air in the chamber was just didn't have anywhere to go. So that's why he recommended adding more vents in, uncovering the desks or uncovering the floors, vents covered by the desks, and by lowering the first floor offices to expand that shaft underneath the house floor to allow just more space for that air to go. So, yeah.
There were days with all the gas, was there fire in the Capitol building, in this building, I mean, not the new one here, but the old one next door?
Oh, in the second Capitol?
Well.
Or
1879.
yeah, okay, yeah. The only major fire in the current Capitol was actually in the 1930s and took place mostly on the ground floor of the building. So as far as we know, the gas lights did not cause any major fires. That was the one explosion I mentioned is the one that we know of. There may have been more, might find out about those later. I don't know how often that occurred, but yeah, we got pretty lucky.
What's interesting about that explosion is that the room, they noted in the article that they kept the gas flowing overnight. They actually usually kept the chandeliers lit overnight in this specific room. And the reason why the explosion went off, because a draft came through the window and blew out the flames. So then you can say that in most of the Capitol at night, overnight, they kept the gas flowing for the entire night.
Yeah, they might have.
So then thinking of that amount of coal gas that people would walk into the next day. Just, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, on the outside of the dome? Yeah, so those bird cage lights on the exterior were taken off in 1950 or 53, somewhere around there. They were replaced with floodlights that sat like on the roof of the building. At the same time, they were doing a whole kind of electrical reworking. So I assume they looked at those birdcage lights and said that that's not practical or that's not cost efficient, or they just wanted like a more modern design. Interestingly, when the floodlights go on the roof, that's also when we lost the original cupolas, because apparently they were casting weird shadows onto the dome. So they just ripped them off. Yeah. Anything else for questions? All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, folks. Hope to see you next month in May. And feel free to come up and check out our